ready to go, I'm going to introduce you.
Yes, yes. I'm ready to go.
Okay. Hi, folks. Welcome here to our Labs Research Forum, official research forum of the season. I hope you have all enjoyed the great variety of things that we've done all year long. And let me first acknowledge that we are on traditional territories of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee tribes. And I would like to say that we're all very lucky to be here and in person. And I'm really grateful for everyone who's been able to come to this room, but I'm also grateful to everyone who's visiting us remotely. And I just want to make sure that got across because it's really nice to be among human beings. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Angela Facundo, who is our very own, and I see a number of her students from her classes here, and that's, come on in. And that's very reassuring. Angela's a beloved teacher here. And as I learned only this morning, which only attests to my slowness, she did her PhD at York and is acquainted with my spouse, Karen Valahora, who sends warm and excited greetings for your talk.
Oh, thanks, Karen.
Angela is our literary theory specialist, working in queer theory and psychoanalysis and contemporary fiction. She's also a candidate at the Toronto Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. So there's lots going on here. Her book, Oscillations of Literary Theory, develops a new reading practice by engaging with queer theory and psychoanalysis. Empathy and human attachment are part of what Angela does all the time in the classroom, on paper, and I expect we're going to hear a bit of that in our talk today. Her title is called Moving Slowly in Love and Hate, Free Association and Empathy in Ishiguro's The Buried Giant. Angela.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And thank you everyone for being here. It's so lovely to see all of you in person. And it's lovely to be at the front of the classroom, which I haven't done in many years, like I think 6. Can you hear me back there? We're all good? Okay, awesome. Today I want to talk about my research, which is very much in progress, but I'm excited to present to you today. I want to have a more informal discussion, hopefully after, so I really would love questions from the people on Zoom and the people in this room here today. So thank you very much. I know that some of you have read The Buried Giant, but I know that many of you may not have. So if you haven't, I'm going to spoil it for you today. Sorry about that. But whether or not you've read the novel, I want to think with you today about larger question about the role of literary reading, specifically close reading in the contemporary moment. So at a high level, I want to consider in reading Buried Giant, the link between close reading and mental health at a very high level. What's the link there? And as many of you know, I have returned in 2020 to academia after having spent 4 years in a digital consultancy. So that question has persisted for me through that work. And since I've returned, I've done a lot of thinking through my teaching. So because of that, I want to thank my students for taking the time to think with me. A lot of the messaging you'll find familiar, and it's definitely variations on the theme, but I want to introduce Christopher Bolus today. It's a new figure that I'm working with. So today I want to explore literary reading as a very particular textual engagement that is maybe becoming increasingly rare today, especially in the time of digital experiences, but also in the wake of new reading practices. So post-critical reading, reparative reading, distant reading, surface reading, a lot of which is made possible by the digital humanities. At stake for me today is empathy, the question of empathy. Now, over the past few years, empathy has become a very popular concept. I think it maybe started with Brene Brown's TED Talk in 2010 about vulnerability and empathy. It's very popular, it's pretty good. But since then, empathy has become a question, especially through the pandemic. So there's an empathy shortage because of social media. The World Economic Forum says that employees from the humanities make great workers because they are empathic. The Chronicle of Higher Ed has called for more funding of the humanities. It's crucial because they are empathy incubators. So empathy has kind of entered our collective consciousness in a very particular way. And in all of those conversations, one of the central assumptions is that reading literature elaborates empathy. And this is kind of a given, like we all understand this as literary scholars. Reading literature elaborates empathy because when we read literature, we're able to put ourselves in the shoes of another. So this is a very popular definition of empathy, to put oneself in the position of the other. Everyone takes for granted that definition, but I want to explore in particular the how. So what are the mechanisms that actually link the narrative text to greater empathic potentials? And I want to shift our understanding of empathy just a little bit. And this brings me to my three-pronged argument here. And this is my definition, provisionally, empathy is an irresolvable but productive tension between sameness and difference. 2, that close reading elaborates empathy through free association. And 3, that free association helps us develop an intimacy with otherness, both outside and within the self. So an otherness within the self. As you can see, psychoanalysis and queer theory inform my exploration always. So the first part of my talk will take you through the writings of Christopher Bolus. He throws out a lot of new terminology there. And this is new terminology for concepts that you might find familiar. So I'm going to walk you through that. But what I want you to pay attention to is how he redescribes free association so that we can think about this new definition of empathy together. And then the second half of my talk, I'm going to take a look at how all of this, empathy, free association, close reading, come together and play out in a reading of The Buried Giant. As always in my work, I answer Eve Sedgwick's now famous call for a reparative reading. So reparative reading is a kind of an addition to this hermeneutic practice of exposure and critique. You expose an injustice and you critique it. Reparative reading, some say disagree with that, some say move to the side of that. I would say would add to that. It's less about exposure and critique and more about a putting together. But that call is heavily psychoanalytic, so let's go there first. Okay, so Christopher Bolus is a contemporary British psychoanalyst. He is working in private practice today. And his writings reflect very creatively with Freud and another second generation psychoanalyst, British psychoanalyst called D.W. Winnicott. So he's kind of like a contemporary reader of Winnicott. And his writing, particularly Evocative Object Worlds and Being in Character, has very much helped me sort out object relations theory. So he's really great at that. And I want to show you Bolus's first paragraphs. It opens with direct address. And immediately the reader loses themselves. And I want to quote it at length because it's a beautiful set of images. And if this will let me, I'm going to show you a video. These are videos that I took on my commute between Toronto and Kingston. So watch the videos, listen to the text, and enjoy. Okay. You are riding in a train, absorbed by the sights flying by. It passes an airport, crosses a canal, traverses a meadow, climbs a long, low hill graced by rows of vineyards, descends into a valley choked with industrial parks, winds its way through dark forests, and finally comes to the outskirts of the small city where you are to disembark. Each location evokes sets of associations. The airport reminds you of the coming summer and your holiday abroad. It recalls the plane that brought you to this part of the world in the first place, the never-ending expansions of airports, new aircraft on the design boards, the oddity of flight itself, and innumerable part thoughts that almost enter consciousness, but don't quite make it. Crossing the canal, you think of a longed-for trip on a canal boat yet to be accomplished, signifying the potential remainders of a life. You think of the Erie Canal in America and the songs and folklore linked to it. You think of your mother and father-in-law's former house, which was alongside a small canal. You might also think of the dentist and a root canal. So here are the associations: dentist and the root canal. And so it goes for the other objects passed along this journey. So here, Bolus is reminding us of Freud's description of free association as the central psychoanalytic method. When you're in psychoanalysis, you just say what comes to your mind without focusing on anything in particular. And this opening plays on Freud's analogy that he makes between free association and psychoanalysis. He says, it's as if you're riding in a train and the person sitting next to the window describes everything that passes for the person that's sitting in the aisle. So that's a kind of free association. And for Freud, free association, when you meander long enough, can sometimes unbury or touch upon long repressed memories, even traumas that you then work through. So free association gets you there. In a more contemporary context, Bolus would describe free association, the goal of free association, to kind of get people unstuck in their thinking. So to loosen the inhibitions of thought, to loosen fixations, and to think more creatively and more expansively. So those are the two effects of free association. Bolus notes, quote, as you can see here, there is then no single chain of thought. Rather, multiple lines of psychic interest moving through moments of life like some silent, radiant intelligence. So Bolus's imagery exemplifies this kind of branching out of the subject's thought through metaphor and metonymy. And what forms as a result is this matrix of the unconscious. It happens through speech. And so the wonderful thing about free association is that it requires objects. And so when I talk about objects, when I invoke objects, I think about objects broadly. So these could be external objects, a person that you're in love with or your mother, internal objects, a memory of a family member. It could be an object that one encounters when you're wandering, like an arch of a building or a hawthorn bush. So any kind of object in the landscape. And Bolus describes the everyday experience of investing parts of oneself in those objects as we move through the world. He says, quote, as we constantly endow objects with psychic meaning, we therefore walk amidst our own significance. And sometimes, long after we have invested a thing, we encounter it again releasing its meaning. And so much of this process is profoundly unconscious. This is how we get attached to any environment. So we get attached to a city, we like certain routes, we get attached to a landscape, we get attached to a house. In that attachment, we also encounter unconscious residues that others have left behind in their investments. He says, quote, "To leave a home, even when the contents go with us, is to lose the nooks and crannies of parts of ourselves, nesting places for our imagination. We shall always linger on in our former homes, just as we assume that upon moving into a new dwelling, its former inhabitants will also still be there." So these worlds in which we meander are rich with ghosts, both ours and not ours. Let's see. And this kind of shifts our understanding for Bolus of what meaning might be. What is meaning? Meaning simply can be an emotional investment, particularly an emotional investment in objects that get released upon every encounter, which is a wonderfully evocative image of meaning. So free association is an aleatory movement, and aleatory just describes this idea of wandering. And it's a wandering that is characterized by randomness and chance. As we free associate, our meandering is punctuated by objects that are saturated with significance. He calls this islands. We get caught up as we meander. We get caught up in islands of emotional experience. Simply put, objects are evocative. They make us think, feel, remember, get a sense of other things, get surprised by things that don't belong to our consciousness. In the encounter, what gets reawakened in us are, quote, clusters of feeling, imagery, somatic states, memories, and the sexual states that partly drove the initial investiture. This engagement is something that Bolus describes as erotic. It is an expression and a reawakening of our sexuality. So as we meander through the world, our sexuality is engaged and it is largely unconscious. So this brings me to his rich set of terminology. So you might be familiar with the terms on the left, but he kind of adjusts them on the right. Every day, inert objects transform into what Bolus calls psychic genera. And psychic genera, it sounds abstract, but it's generative, right? These are psychic genera. Objects are not inert, they are dynamic. In turn, the self becomes transformed into what Bolus calls a character. And the description of character is lovely. He says, a character is a symphony of the self that uses the other as an instrument to play its idiom. And idiom denotes a kind of individual singular style. So the way that you use objects, the way that you interact with objects, it produces your idiom, it produces your style. And it has everything to do with how you invest in those objects. Now, this point brings us to a nuanced paradox of self and other. And this is a more difficult concept, the unthought known. He's become well known for this concept. And it is paradoxical. I'm just gonna read this at length because I think his description is quite clear. The unthought known is something known about, indeed deeply informative of any self's being and relating, but something which must be experienced and can only meagerly be described. This is our otherness. So our otherness is embedded in this unthought known. As the movement of idiom conveyed by any self and experienced by its others, Otherness both is and is not a property of each self. Otherness is and is not a property of each self. Although it derives from the self, it can only be experienced by an other. Communication of our otherness is the path our being takes in and through life. So as we move through life, we are communicating our otherness, and it's not something that we can merely describe. It's something that we have to release into experience. And when we free associate, we are communicating our otherness. And when we communicate our otherness, it becomes a form of personal creativity. That's what Bolus labels it as. It's a form of personal creativity. And so we arrive at the 4 stages of self-experience. And this is kind of like a summary of all of this. Stage 1, I use the object. So I pick up a book, I read it. Stage 2, I am played by the object. It transforms me through my use. Stage 3, I am lost in self-experiencing. So I lose myself in the object. But the beautiful thing that Bolus points out about losing oneself is that you lose the self, the prior self state, but also the integrity of the object is also destroyed. So it's a kind of mutual transformation. The object changes through your use of it. And then stage 4, I observe the self as an object. And this is kind of where psychoanalysis comes in. When you're in that analysis, you think of moments in which your prior self state is destroyed and transformation has happened. And that moment of narration is an experience of a complex self. So this is kind of key for Bolus. And at stake is the project to seek objects with evocative integrity that challenge and stretch the self. So this process is a process of self-stretching. And this stretch depends on the particular form of the object. He talks about the eros of form. So what we're actually stretching with is the object's form. It becomes a prioritization of form over the name of the object. So, and you know, anybody who has fallen in love has experienced this. The object changes in your mind as the form becomes defamiliarized. The object's particularity of form, it structures the subject's inner experience. So form is crucial to the structure of the inner experience. The more evocative the form, the more complex the inner experience, and the greater the stretch of self. And what better object to help us stretch than the literary one, right? In light of this understanding of free association and objects, where does empathy come into play? Well, we can return to this popular definition of empathy. And it's strange because in evocative object world, Bolus repeats this kind of cursory definition of empathy. He says, quote, the capacity to put oneself in another's position. And this event is what psychoanalysis calls projective identification. So if you think about the word projective identification, you're projecting a piece of yourself into the other, and you're saying, hey, we're the same, right? You're projecting, so it's projective identification. And clinically speaking, this is a psychical defense. It's something to work through. It can cause a stalemate because a patient, if full of projective identifications and if they kind of move through the world full of projective identifications, they can only see the world as parts and pieces and fragments of themselves in order to reaffirm the ego. So there's no change there. So there's something problematic potentially about projective identification because it is based on the logic of sameness. But when we're talking about the evocative object, we're talking about a very different form of projective identification. It's not based on sameness. The identification necessarily with an evocative object, with evocative forms, it necessarily gets displaced into difference, into otherness. And this is where the unthought known comes up. And that is through an attention to the object's form. One could posit this kind of attention as erotic, one that's exciting, sticky, surprising. Bolus states, through this particular type of projective identification, we psychically signify objects, but as they retain their own intrinsic value, they can be said to occupy an intermediate area between the conventional understanding and a private one. So, as Bolus clarifies, this kind of projective identification isn't about our omniscience. It doesn't reaffirm our omniscience about the world. It occurs only by matter of circumstance, by chance, by free association. So free association is a necessary part of the process, a kind of aleatory wandering, a way of moving through the world. And I want to emphasize that empathy emerges through this elaboration of otherness in our capacity to think with and through objects made alien through its form. Far from mutual recognition of sameness, empathy inaugurates a mutual capacity for change. So otherness is the priority. Close reading employs both attention to form and free association. We all do this. And in another paper, I talk about this skill in the context of an algorithm-driven society. I want to think about the digital space and what kinds of digital spaces allow free association to happen and which kinds foreclose free association. There are different kinds, like I'm kind of discovering something called dark UX, something that manipulates our attention, but that's another part of this research in particular. For now, I want to turn to Ishiguro. The Buried Giant. It offers a strange world afflicted with a strange condition. The inhabitants of this world, it's a world made up of Saxons or Britons. So there's a faction there. They have no memory. A persistent enchanted mist that pervades the land robs the inhabitants of any kind of recollections of their past. While these inhabitants are cognitively inhibited, they can still perceive the affect that lingers throughout their environment as they develop a capacity, in Bolus's words, to feel the impressions of life. So they can't remember anything, but they can feel everything. They do this by encountering evocative objects, and buried traumas come to the surface as they proceed on their journey. The novel is set in post-Arthurian England, and it follows two elderly Britons, Axel and Beatrice. There we go. There's a character list. Axel and Beatrice are the main characters. They embark on a quest to find and reconcile with their son. They can't remember what happened to him. Eventually, larger historical forces displace their journey. Along the way, they meet a Saxon knight, Wystan. He's in his prime and his memories are relatively intact. They also meet Sir Gawain. Both knights, and Sir Gawain's like a little senile, like he's really old. He's a little bit of a comical figure at the beginning, at least. Both knights claim their mission to slay Quirrigg, who is a dragon. And you know, everyone talks about how fierce this dragon is, and they want to slay Quirrigg because her breath is the thing that releases the mist that makes everyone forget. So she needs to die. As the quest unfolds, the reader discovers that the Britons committed genocide against the Saxons. So mostly women and children died. And in that genocide, they broke a treaty to protect the innocents that Axel, the main character, had actually brokered as one of the king's ambassadors. After the Saxon slaughter, King Arthur had imposed peace on the land by getting Merlin to curse Quirrigg with the magical breath. So then the Britons had forgotten their complicity, while the Saxons had forgotten their rage at the injustice. Wyston's mission to slay Quirrigg would restore the memory and trauma in the Saxons and would incite vengeful blood. This was the plan. And Sir Gawain eventually reveals himself as Quirrigg's protector to maintain the peace in honor of the now dead Arthur's wishes. So at the end, I'm going to tell you the ending. At the end, they duel. Sir Gawain loses. Wyston kills the dragon and leaves the reader with this sense of dread, anticipating future war. Meanwhile, as Axel and Beatrice bear witness, they're kind of witnesses, they bear witness to the unfolding of these events, they realize that they're not going to find their son because their son's dead, but they're going on their way to a strange island where people roam in solitude for the rest of time. So all this time, their quest was a preparation for Beatrice's death. Her health declines throughout the novel, and at the end, she must leave Axel and go with the boatman to the island. So not exactly an uplifting story, but there you have it. So scholarship on Ishiguro focuses on a few themes. Scholars like Bernadette Myler and Ivan Stacy explore this question of how to document history in a responsible way, in a way that would likely prevent us from repeating it. Allegorical considerations respond to Ishiguro's own suggestion in his 2017 Nobel lecture that this is a reflection, or this is a kind of contemplation of our contemporary moment, how there is a buried giant that's coming to the surface, namely early 20th century violence that is now reemerging in the contemporary moment. So the return of fascism specifically. Jonathan Brent and Matthew Ito grapple with this uneasy fit with genre. So they talk about the source, medieval source text, Arthurian romance, fantasy, and how this novel kind of fits and doesn't fit. But I want to focus on the stakes of literary study, because one of the central questions for me that this novel asks is, how do we read at a time like this? Today, I only have time to focus on the beginning and the end of the novel. The opening of Ishiguro's novel presents a striking contrast to Bolas's first lines. So I have it here. So think back to Bolas and the train, and then compare it to this passage. You would have searched a long time for the sort of winding lane or tranquil meadow for which England later became celebrated. There were instead miles of desolate, uncultivated land. Here and there, rough-hewn paths over craggy hills or bleak moorland. Most of the roads left by the Romans would by then have become broken or overgrown, often fading into wilderness. Icy fogs hung over rivers and marshes, serving all too well the ogres that were then still native to this land. Like Bolas, the narrator begins with direct address, so the reader is immediately implicated. But what follows is a series of disconnections, of failed associations. This opening is temporally disorienting. It indicates, the first sentence, that this tale happens in the past, but it expresses it through a kind of narrative prolepsis rather than an analepsis. So I'm drawing from Gerard Genet here. Analepsis is narrative that describes past events, and prolepsis is narrative that anticipates future events. The opening subjunctive proleptically invokes a free association about the English countryside that would be frustrated. You would have searched a long time for something that has not happened yet. The passage then analeptically gestures back to the Romans and their associated objects, lost to ruins, lost to time. The narrator defines this time period negatively. The winding road that connects one in one's imagination gives way to brokenness, to fragments that make moving through the worlds, both the landscape and the narrative itself, difficult. The land becomes unfamiliar and resists romanticization. The opening sets the scene, one in which, as we will see, the aleatory wanderings of the characters becomes the central drama. Can they get to where they're going, wherever that might be? And can they make sense of their past in order to deal with the relationships of their present? The entrance of the ogre in the last sentence, an object rich with associations, finally orients us to the genre of this fantasy, yet that too becomes unfamiliar as more objects enter the scene. But such monsters were not cause for astonishment. People then would have regarded them as everyday hazards. And in those days, there was so much else to worry about. How to get food out of the hard ground, how not to run out of firewood, how to stop the sickness that could kill a dozen pigs in a single day and produce green rashes on the cheeks of children. Ironically, the fantastical object, the ogre, does not inspire as much astonishment as the mundane. The hard ground, the firewood, sickness, green rashes. And as the reader meets Axel and Beatrice, we begin to piece together all of the enigmas that the novel has to resolve. What robbed the people of their memory? What traumas haunt Saxons and Britons? Where is Axel and Beatrice's son? And where exactly are they going? Because the characters in the novel can't rely on their memory as a frame of reference, these characters have difficulty attaching to the world. They only have a vague sense of what they love and hate, but their journey involves the process of familiarizing themselves with their affective attachments through random encounters with objects that cross their path. So they need the objects that randomly they encounter. They have to draw from other resources than memory in order to navigate the world. So I emphasize that free association is vital in this world to survival and to reawaken old attachments. For example, the angle of approach of a guard on horseback gives Axel a sense of his military past. The green of a cloak rekindles a bitterness and a sense of betrayal in Beatrice against Axel. A particular flower triggers a memory of when Axel and Beatrice meet. But the novel can be confusing because objects are not as they first appear. So it's in third person narrative. It's a third person narrative, and it's predominantly focused through Axel's character. Well, the character list is gone, through Axel's character. We see the narrative through other points of view, but it's predominantly Axel. But everybody's lack of memory seems to inhibit their perception. The characters meander through a defamiliarized world, saturated with islands of emotional experience as a result of collective trauma. By necessity, in the wake of lost memory, characters decipher objects by reading their form, picking up on the amorphous affect lingering in objects and giving them pause. In other words, they have to close read. In close reading form, with all five senses, they activate memories long buried, both theirs and not theirs. It begins with misrecognition, and then through a reading of form, they come to know what they're actually looking at. It's particularly scenes of violence. So, for example, an ogre's severed head, to Beatrice and Axel's view, in the flickering light becomes an ogre's severed arm. So they misrecognize it as a head. a dead baby to Beatrice that she finds on the ground in a tunnel. It's actually a fresh corpse of a bat to everybody else. So misrecognitions, they have to kind of navigate through this labyrinth of misrecognitions, and they can only figure out what they're looking at when they pay attention to form. And in this scene, the ambiguity of the baby and the bat leads Sir Gawain into a defensive rant, disavowing his complicity in the genocide. Quote, "What are you suggesting, sir? I saw no skulls. And what if there are a few bones here? Were you there, sir? Did you stand beside the great Arthur?" So he hit the kind of object in the present, takes him back into the past, and exposes his guilt. This scene resonates with Bolus's redescription of objects. Quote, "All the time, as we amble about in our worlds, we come across objects, whether natural or man-made, material or mental. For the unconscious, there is no difference between material and non-material evocative objects. Both are equally capable of putting the self through a complex inner experience. So in this story, memory-inhibited characters don't have an accurate perception of the world, but living in the world has less to do with accurate perception than an immersion in evocative form, and this is what they must do in order to move forward. The climax of the novel brings us the devastating twist that is so common in Ishiguro's work. They arrive at the dragon Quirig's lair, and instead of confronting a fierce, fire-breathing dragon, they see something strange. And before I show you the text, I'm just gonna read it to you so that you can visualize it as I read. As for the dragon, it was hardly clear at first she was alive. Her posture, prone, head twisted to one side, limbs outspread, might easily have resulted from her corpse being hurled into the pit from a height. In fact, it took a moment to ascertain this was a dragon at all. She was so emaciated, she looked more some worm-like reptile, accustomed to water, that had mistakenly come aground and was in the process of dehydrating. Her skin, which should have appeared oiled and of a color not unlike bronze, was instead a yellowing white, reminiscent of the underside of certain fish. The remnants of her wings were sagging folds of skin that a careless glance might have taken for dead leaves accumulated to either side of her. The head being turned against the gray pebbles, Axel could only see the one eye, which was hooded in the manner of a turtle's, and which opened and closed lethargically according to some internal rhythm. This movement and the faintest rise and fall along the creature's backbone were the only indicators that Quirig was alive. So I've read some quite moving close readings of this novel from a wide variety of student papers. This passage is one of my favorites. And I've read brilliant close readings of this passage, getting a sense of individual students' idioms, their free associating with the similes. But for now, I want to focus simply on Axel's narrative focalization. The dragon is an object that surprises, simply because she ages. She's subject to time. The name of the dragon and its old associations, this kind of internal object that everybody is afraid of, gives way to her form. And in this passage, uncertainty and speculation qualify each of Axel's associations. She becomes unclear, and Axel must rely on his free associations to take in the scene. He kind of triangulates the object that he's looking at. And it is a scene of slow and lonely death. Her posture is as if her body was thrown from a height. Her emaciated corporeality is like a dehydrating worm-like reptile. Her skin like the underside of a fish, remnants of wings, dead leaves. her eye, the hood of her eye, like a turtle's. Axel's free associations encourages our own, the reader's own, inciting conceptual branching out that captures the defamiliarization of the dragon, now turned exploited creature and casualty of human war. And after this scene, Gawain tries to convince Wystan that she only has a few weeks to live, just let her die in peace. Wystan's determined he has to kill her. And so they engage in a duel that neither of them want because of their mutual respect for one another. And it's another beautiful scene. But Wystan defeats Gawain and he climbs back into the pit to complete his mission to behead Quirrell. And here's the other passage that I want to read out to you. Down in the pit, neither the dragon's position nor posture had changed. If her senses were warning her of the proximity of strangers, and of one in particular making his way down the steep side of the pit, Quirrell gave no indication of it. Or could it be the rise and fall of her spine had become a little more pronounced? And was there a new urgency in the hooded eye as it opened and shut? Axel could not be sure. But as he continued to gaze down at the creature, the idea came to him that the hawthorn bush, the only other thing alive in the pit, had become a source of great comfort to her. And even now, in her mind's eye, she was reaching for it. Axel realized the idea was fanciful, yet the more he watched, the more credible it seemed. For how was it a solitary bush was growing in a place like this? Could it not be that Merlin himself had allowed it to grow there so that the dragon would have a companion? The heart-wrenching part of this passage for me, so it's cut off a little bit there, is that we actually can't be certain that Quirrell is reaching for her friend, the little hawthorn bush. Can't be certain. We have to see it through Axel's imagination. We know Quirrell's desperation through Axel's projective identification with her, as well as our own projective identification with Axel's point of view. It's a narrative mediation with multiple layers. The way the passage progresses, again, this form is so common in the novel, begins with misrecognition and then gets revised. And that revision requires free association and attention to form. So in the passage, at first, to Axel's mind, she doesn't sense the danger, but then she reaches for her object of comfort as she faces a death that even in her old age, she would never want. This dying creature clings to life through her evocative object, her hawthorn bush. In turn, her reach becomes Axel's reach, evoking for the reader an implacable attachment to life that can persist amidst histories of loss and destruction. But all of this is on the edge of thought. Projective identification requires an imaginative reach, but conviction cannot stabilize it. It can't be stabilized by certainty. The uncertainty is where the irreconcilable tension between sameness and difference arises in empathy. Through this tension between sameness and difference, both self and object transform. By close reading Axel and Beatrice's close readings, the reader receives the sense that empathy has less to do with omniscience than it does with aleatory wandering of both body and thought. In light of the novel, we learn that close reading isn't a set of equations. This word equals that thought, or this word equals that concept, or that means that definitively, but a series of displacements that undermine the certainty of sameness. It can't be. Close reading involves a reaching, a longing for the other in our interactions with evocative objects. And if we can learn something larger from the buried giant, I would even go so far as to argue that in a world that is falling apart, close reading is one of the central resources we have at hand to generate empathy. A more nuanced kind, which our contemporary moment is lacking. Close reading involves our capacity to make sense of something rendered unfamiliar. But in order to do the labor of making sense of the unfamiliar, we have to acknowledge the unfamiliar as such. We have to see it as unfamiliar, and we have to break our habits of disavowing otherness through the logic of sameness. Only in order to say, I know how you feel. Instead, we can ask, how does an encounter confound us? Can we swim in that? Can we swim and play with part objects that reflect back to us, not the same as us, but as other, as transformed and transforming? Close reading helps us play with unthought knowns, to go back to Bolus. These kernels of emotional experience help us self-stretch in the face of personal and collective histories, in the face of long-buried hatred, long-buried love, and impossible wishes. Thank you.
Angela, we have about half an hour for questions and answers and so on. And so I'm going to back off. You can ask off. Just to let you field questions.
Great. Yes.
Really different again. I really enjoyed that class we had 2020. But like, yeah, the question I had was like, yeah, related to objects, right? Like, I mean, you were talking about how one object can mean something entirely different to another person. I mean, can mean something different to another person, but yet it can mean something entirely different. But yeah, it's like, you know, different objects represent different things to different people, right? That's the basis of that of that theory. So like, I was wondering, yeah, based off of I mean, the ending of the book, right? Had Beatrice and Axel stood up after their
Yes, yeah.
after their past was revealed in more light. So I mean, I was wondering if these objects are capable of causing as much sorrow as they are joy. Like perhaps some of them would be better off being buried, like the title.
Are objects better off being buried? I mean, it's a good question. So the question is, are objects better off being buried because you know, they're necessarily unstable? It doesn't matter because they mean different things to different people. Then what's the point of having it unearthed? And I think it's a very difficult question, and I think it's a question that the novel refuses to answer. So Whiston is a knight, and he's kind of like a symbol of truth. He needs to unearth the object of the genocide. So he believes in a kind of truth, and a part of you identifies with him. But I think whether or not an object is buried, whether or not you can see an object, you still feel the affective push. And this is what repression is. Like, you can hide an object, but you can still pick up on the affect. And this is what Bolus was trying to get at, that through free association, we can give form to these objects and make these objects articulable to us. When you want to link it to, so in the end, Axel wants to get in the boat with Beatrice because he wants to spend the rest of eternity with her. This is another fantasy that just plays through the novel. And in the end, he has to accept that everyone dies alone, and he walks away. And I think, I mean, it's interesting, Michael, that you made that connection. I think that kind of insistence on separation, that insistence on a lonely existence, is what makes our exchange of objects so rich. like I exchange this object through my encounter with the object. I make a relationship with you. But the fact that I'm not in your place, the fact that we are individuated, that we are separate people, and that everyone dies alone, that makes the object ever more precious. So, is there a hand? No? Yes.
Yes, very nice to see you again, Dr. Facundo.
Yes.
I have a question also out of the book.
Yes.
When Axel and Beatrice split up, he's kind of like giving her away as an object, to
Yeah.
the island, right? So
Mhm.
what is he going back to, do you think? It's kind of left ambiguous, but there is definitely, you can't, I don't know if you could really argue that there isn't. There is definitely a feeling that is left with you as you read, what is the line, like he swims, he turns back to the shore, no, he does not hear me and he swims onward or something.
Yeah, he doesn't turn around. The boatman is trying to say, I'll come back for you, even though it's like they both know it's a lie.
Oh, no, I remember that, but he does not hear me and he wades on, I think is the line.
Yes, he wades on,
Yeah.
back to land. I think, again, like that kind of, the reader has to leave Axel too. So there's a kind of uncertainty about his fate. So he was, as the novel progresses, he's a very likable character, but he's kind of half present. And then we realize that he was, despite himself, complicit in the genocide by earning the trust of the Saxons by brokering this treaty. It's like, we're not going to kill any innocent people. And that made them vulnerable to slaughter. So he's implicated in this plot, and what he faces in the future after Beatrice dies is insistently uncertain. Like he can face justice because now all the Saxons remember what he did, or or he can get away with it. So that also is a kind of unanswerable question. And you don't, I mean, like the speculation follows, but you can't be certain. And that in that act, when Axel is letting go of his object, we have to then let him go and let him face his fate, which doesn't exist because it's a narrative. Ruth?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to put this. I just feel that the novel really is actually pretty ambiguous about memory, and it's pretty clear that Winston's that the whole point of remembering truth is to accept revenge, and it's based on Yugoslavia, and that the idea that you don't forget because you're going to kill everybody who killed you, and so. I guess I'm sort of wondering how we fit that with empathy,
Yeah.
And also the same thing, I think it's true of Axel and Beatrice a bit, in that when they start remembering their life, they remember betrayals, and they have this huge love and devotion before they remember stuff. So it's like they can live in this. They have emotions without having memory, which is very, very important.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
I know people with dementia how that is.
Mhm.
I've encountered that kind of thing. So it just seems to me that it's hard to connect memory always with empathy. I know you're not really doing that simple connection, but I just like, I just wondered if you could respond.
Yeah, it's so the question is, how do we connect memory with empathy? Is empathy possible when one remembers? And that too is a very difficult question. If we think through the text, Wystan is this figure of memory. He remembers, but he also doesn't close read. He's not a close reader. And so I think the question for us as readers who have both memory and an affective life is, how do we actually integrate memory while working through trauma without actually feeding into a repetition compulsion of violence. And I think, it's interesting that Ishiguro chose to write a novel about people with no memory and all of the emotion, as opposed to none of the emotion and all memory. So I think this version teaches us something about the power of affect and the possibility of working through regardless of your cognitive capacity. So there's something unconscious that's happening beyond our cognition, because memory is very, very like they have unconscious memories. They don't have conscious memories. Yeah, Harrison?
Just on that topic of empathy and memory, I thought the novel was pretty ambiguous at the end about that. I think about Liston's last conversation with Axel, where he tells them because of his time among the Saxons,
Yes.
he would be unable to engage in war. He wouldn't be able to do it. He wants them to be a new generation of Saxons that will have those memories and will remember the old trauma that's been buried and be able to wage that war. But he personally tells them that he can't do that. And then again, there's also that his duel with Gawain obviously is really struggles with that. No one, neither of them want that fight. The memory of these times they've spent together, the respect for each other creates an empathy that prevents that conflict or defers it.
Yes, yes. And even the duel, the scene of the duel is very moving because they're killing each other, Wystan and Sir Gawain. But it's a duel that is so full of empathy, like so full of connection and I would say love. Like they love each other and they're killing each other. And then Wystan, after he kills the dragon, he's full of sorrow. He's full of sorrow about the future that he has come brought into being. So the thing about empathy and memory is that if we fixate too much on the content of memory, then empathy is foreclosed. So when you remember something and you go over it, you go over it in your head over and over and over again as something that kind of it determines your character, it determines your personality. You can't get over it. Then that is a memory that forecloses empathy because it inhibits your capacity to free associate. So rather than choosing between, okay, an accurate memory, an accurate perception of the world, this accurate look at injustice, this scene of injustice. And this is what happens with Wystan, I think, at the end. He becomes transformed, but it's a little bit too late. Then you can instead of choosing between an accurate memory and an empathic life, integrating it might look like you remember, but your free associations can loosen the fixations and the inhibitions that are attached to that memory. Oh, let's go to the back over there.
This is some more sort of metatextual question, I guess, but like, because this is so much a book about like memory and lack of it, I thought about it very interesting that Isilfus is such a famous myth for it. And
Yes, yeah.
Guru, I honestly haven't read this book, but Ishiguro's work is a lot about these very English myths and cultures and ideas. I mean, the days like the old image of the English country house. But I guess, what do you make of him using this sort of image of like one of the most famous fairy tales, I guess, as kind of a metaphor for a lack of memory, like most famous memory, folk memory, as a sort of spectre for lack of memory, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the question was, Ishiguro chose one of the most famous old tales, and what's the relationship between that and this theme of memory. It's interesting because he deals with memory in most of his in all of his novels. Like memory is the theme, and this oscillation between recollection and repression is the I can't look at this. This is too disorienting. I have to step back. the oscillation between repression and recollection is where the conflict kind of revolves. So this is a motif in Ishiguro. But to go back to the fantastical, I think it has something to do with this idea of free association and my reading of the beginning. Like we all know, we're all familiar with this tale where we are image saturated with fantasy, and thank you, and and the first lines immediately disorient you. So one of the most kind of reified tales and reified genres is subject to defamiliarization. And I think you can say that with any particular text in that genre, but Ishiguro really highlights that. That's what I would say. Yes.
Yes, I haven't read The Very Giant, so this might not be as well-defined a question as some of the others have been, but I'm very intrigued by the Arthurian setting as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you would have anything to say about how that Arthurian setting might speak to your argument about the development of empathy, specifically towards the texts from the distant past that we study as literary critics. I think there's anything specific there about, how do we approach the authors of medieval texts or people from others?
How do we approach the authors of medieval texts or very similar pasts, reaching across great distances? And what does that have to do with the development of empathy? I mean, I'm thinking of, there's a passage in Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. He says that we can't possibly empathize people who suffer in periods that are not our own, because we can't actually imagine what their constitution is. So Freud in that description talks about the impossibility of empathy, especially when we're imposing our own contemporary moment to an anachronistic past. What's interesting about this reading is that it's a contemporary text about medieval source texts, intertexts. And so I think, again, I think that because this is a contemporary text, and in this research, I think I have to go back to the source texts. How we read those texts, you can ask Dr. Papano. But how we read a contemporary representation of those texts is to think about the affect of reaching back and imagining, and in that affect, to feel the failure of it, to feel the gap. Yes. Yes. Okay.
Yes, I want to ask about the Ishiguro's iteration of Arthur, or as a figure, I mean, anyone who does Arthur, you see him as this indomitable moral king who does everything he can to make his realm a Camelot or Round Table, depending on whatever you read, as moral, as ethical, as utopian as possible, right? He has this reputation that he upholds. And Ishiguro's text is one among many actually that takes the king in a rather negative light and take away from his and takes away from his shining knight in armor imagery. It's even Gavin was talking about it a bit, right? When he was talking about his relationship with his uncle and how close they once were, and so on and so forth. It's like memory distorts, right? Everyone's perception, everyone's memory of someone, something is distorted based on their own experiences. And I found it very interesting that Ishiguro utilized, Arthur, right? Like his tarnished image comparison to, I was wondering what we thought about Ishiguro's iteration of Arthur, right? And how the king's once utopian image is tarnished to produce this really negative coverage of it in the novel as this purveyor of genocide and this
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the, so I think this is one of the surprises. So what about Arthur and his representation in this negative light as opposed to a figure of kind of moral idealization? I think a lot of literature make that flip, like this kind of idealization turned into a bad object, good object and bad object. I don't have an opinion on Arthur because he's a ghost that haunts the narrative, but he's not a character and he's not subject to narrative focalization. He's just kind of like this, yeah, I would say a ghost, a trace. So, Naz?
This is a personal question, but what was your first Ishiguro and what was your reaction?
My first Ishiguro. My first Ishiguro was Never Let Me Go. I read it in grad school in a psychoanalysis course. And my reaction to Never Let Me Go, my initial reaction was boredom. He's boring. He's boring. Yeah, he's really boring. I mean, like, he's boring. He's boring, but he's asking you to slow down, right? So, so when you read Ishiguro's text, you kind of have. I had to read it twice, and the only thing that really got me attached is when I started putting parts of myself in that text for the purposes of a paper. So I had to produce something out of that text. It was not my choice, and I fell in love. It was like an arranged, partnership. So yeah, that's it. Yeah, Meg.
I'll just note that there's something on the chat.
Oh, okay.
So I can either read it or we can.
Yeah, read it, please.
Okay, sure. I've noticed there is some debate and definition of empathy in terms of the role of cognition versus emotion. Some scholars view it as only perspective taking. Others see affective sharing also essential to its meaning. How do you view the role of emotion and cognition in your reading of empathy? If not contemplated?
Oh, great question. For me, it requires both. So a lot of the debates surround this idea, like, of the observability of empathy. Can we observe it? Can we measure it? Is it cognitive? Is it emotional? And I would say it has to be both emotional, and it requires the capacity to think, right? So, and I read this neuroscientific paper that they're adjusting the definition of empathy by talking about enactments, like unconscious transferences. That so a client says, or a patient says, you're just like my father, and then the psychoanalyst starts acting like their father without knowing it, and it's a kind of stalemate. This is called enactment. And that paper says, actually, that is a very empathic moment because you're there with them in the affect. But I would disagree with that. I would argue that you need the capacity to think, and you need the cognition that is required for close reading and insight in order to make sense of that affect. Where I want to make the adjustment is that all of these definitions of empathy, whether cognitive or affective, they all reinforce this logic of sameness. Like, you're there with them, you understand them, you know them. So great question. Glenn?
This isn't about the novel, but I like what you said about the novel. It's such a beautiful book.
Yes.
So my question is the kind of general one. I'm having a hard time like knowing what angle to take on it, but I'm basically trying to figure out what the role of validity is in the kind of chain of close reading, pre-association, empathy. Part of my mind is interested in whether there's like it's the same in like I guess the therapeutic process that that Lola
Gus is talking about as in kind of an academic sort of criticism context. But basically, I'm just curious, like, what is the role of, I guess, testing for truth or validity or recognition versus misrecognition, whether what you think about the bush is right or wrong.
Right.
Whether the thing you see, the giant you see unburying itself is actually a giant unburying itself or not. Because there seems to be a language of revealing things.
Right,
So how
right.
do we know how do we tell? Yeah.
So the question is the role of validity in close reading and free association. That's a difficult question because we swim in a labyrinth of our own projective identification most of the time, like we're projecting ourselves into the world, and it's really a form of delusion. So it's not valid. A lot of this free association is not valid. It depends on fantasy. It depends on desire, particularly this desire of sameness. And yet, just because it's not true or valid, again, Bolus talks about, living in the world is not about accuracy. It's not about accurate perception. It's about evocation. So I think, and I want to avoid the question like what differentiates a sane person from an insane person, because it's kind of like a spectrum when you think of us moving through the world at various stages of delusion. But those moments of realization where you actually acknowledge a surprise as such, is I think what validity is associated with the capacity for change. I think that's my, and when you're talking about validity in terms of close reading, what differentiates a bad close reading, like an invalid close reading, from, because we're all evaluated on this, a bad close reading from a good close reading does the close reading trace a line of thought through the logic of sameness or not? And if not, how much do you depend on form? So both psychoanalysis and literary reading depend on an almost obsessive attention to form. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It's kind of a big question.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Brock.
Yeah, I guess just to go back to the question sort of like before you the past and the role of like memory and just like acknowledgement of trauma and empathy. There's kind of, we talked in our class when we were reading this about the sort of recurring motif of like light and dark as sort of ignorance or revelations. And characters like Gawain, like in the scene when they're under the abbey, like operating better in the dark and not wanting to actually see things at all.
Right.
And then in that last scene, when Axel finally gets sort of this revelation that he needs to leave Beatrice behind, they keep mentioning how much like the sun is in his eyes, like he's able to see.
Yes.
But these moments in darkness often make characters like fully unable to see objects, and I guess through that like unable to free associate with things.
Yes.
And so do you think that to an extent like hiding from objects around, while it might sort of comfort from trauma, kind of precludes your ability to empathize with?
Yes, I would say so. I would say so. So the capacity to free associate requires that you are able to move through the world, whether you can see or not, some kind of perception of space. That's what triggers free association. And when they can't see, they have to rely on other senses. And that's when, like, and this is the kind of resilience of these characters, even though they're on their way to their own death. This again, like I think to the dragon, reaching for something, reaching for through your senses for a kernel of something that's alive, even when you're facing death. Are we out of time?
Yeah.
3:50 We're out of time. Okay.
So I have two things to say in reverse order. Number two, Angela and I are going to head over to the grad club for a celebratory pint, and everyone should come join us if you wish. And number one, thank you very much.